Welcome to another deep dive. We are going to be diving into the fascinating world of trees.
Yeah.
And for this one, we're going to be looking at a book called The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben.
Excellent book.
Really interesting stuff in this book.
It really is.
And it's going to be kind of a mission for us to uncover some of the surprising ways that trees actually live and communicate
Okay.
and interact with their environment and with each other.
Sounds good.
So I think one of the most interesting things about this book right off the bat that Wohlleben points out is that, when he was first starting out, he was a forester. And he kind of viewed forests through a very specific lens, right? He was looking at them as this source of lumber.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a common way for a lot of people to view forests, just that sort of like timber perspective.
Yeah, and it can be really easy to overlook all of the amazing, intricate lives of individual trees.
Absolutely.
And the forest as a whole,
Yeah.
when you're looking at it from that lens.
It's like seeing the forest for not seeing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So we're going to be taking a look beyond that timber lens.
Okay.
And really trying to understand the full complexity of life in the forest.
Sounds good.
So let's talk about communication, because that's one of the things that I found just absolutely mind-blowing in this book. Like, trees communicate, but they don't do it in a way that we typically think of, right?
Right.
They use smell.
Exactly.
They use taste.
Yeah.
And they even use electrical impulses.
It's amazing.
So can you tell me a little bit about how they use those senses to get their messages across?
Well, let's start with smell. So, like, if you think about, in Africa, you've got these acacia trees.
Yeah.
And when a giraffe starts munching on the leaves of an acacia tree, that tree actually sends out a chemical signal into the air.
Oh, wow.
And all the neighboring acacia trees can smell that. And they're like, oh, danger. Giraffe. And they start producing toxins in their leaves to make themselves less tasty to the giraffe.
It's like an early warning system.
Yeah, it's like an early warning system. It's really incredible.
That's amazing.
It's wild, right? And they can even detect, like you said, they have a sense of taste, so to speak.
Right.
They can detect the saliva of specific insects.
Really?
Yeah. So if a certain type of caterpillar starts munching on an elm or a pine tree, the tree can actually identify that caterpillar's saliva.
Oh, wow.
And then it will release a pheromone that attracts the natural predators of that specific caterpillar.
So it's like calling for backup.
Exactly. It's like calling for backup. Like, hey, wasps, come over here. I've got a buffet for you.
That's incredible.
It is, isn't it? And then, beyond these kind of like airborne signals, we have this amazing underground network that connects trees.
Right, the Wood Wide Web.
The Wood Wide Web, that's a great way to describe it.
Right.
It's this network of fungal threads called mycorrhiza that weave through the soil and connect the roots of different trees.
And what's amazing is that it's not just limited to trees of the same species, right?
That's right. You can have, a birch tree connected to a beech tree connected to an oak tree.
Wow.
All through this fungal network.
So what kinds of things are being shared and communicated through this network?
So they're sharing nutrients like carbon and other essential minerals. They can even send warnings about insect attacks or drought stress.
Really?
Yeah, it's like they're sending out these little messages through the network saying like, hey, watch out, there's a drought coming.
Oh, wow.
Or I'm being attacked by aphids. You might want to get your defenses up.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So they're actually helping each other out.
They are. It's like a big interconnected community down there.
That's amazing.
And, there's even some evidence to suggest that they might be communicating through sound.
Oh, right. I read about that. It's still kind of early research.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But what have they found so far?
So Monica Gagliano and her team have been doing some really interesting work. And they found that the roots of some seedlings actually emit clicking sounds.
Really?
Yeah. And these clicks are around 220 hertz, which is kind of like a middle C on a piano.
Right.
And what's even more interesting is that other seedlings seem to be able to detect these sounds.
Wow. So they might be actually hearing each other.
That's what it seems like, yeah.
So it's like a whole symphony going on underground that we're just starting to tune into.
Exactly. It's a whole world of communication that we're just beginning to understand.
That's incredible. So
Yeah.
we've got smell, we've got taste, we've got electrical signals, we might have sound. It's like this whole...
Amazing how complex it is.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, and this leads to this other idea that Wohlleben talks about a lot in the book, which is this concept of trees actually having social behavior
Yeah.
and even friendships.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what does that even mean? Like, how can trees be friends?
So in undisturbed forests, we see all sorts of evidence that trees are actually supporting each other.
Okay.
Like, if a tree is injured or diseased, its neighbors will actually pump nutrients and sugars to it through the root system or the fungal network.
Wow.
And they can keep those trees alive for centuries.
Really?
Yeah, there are even cases where they've found stumps that have been kept alive for hundreds of years just by their neighbors.
It's like they're not giving up on each other.
Exactly. They're looking after each other.
That's incredible.
And what's really interesting is that this type of support is much less common in planted forests.
Okay.
Like the large coniferous plantations you see, because the planting process often damages the root systems, and that prevents them from forming those strong connections.
Interesting. So the natural forest environment is much more conducive to this
kind
of cooperation and support. So they're not just supporting injured trees.
Right.
They're
also, like synchronizing their behavior.
Synchronizing. What do you mean by that?
So they've done studies in beech forests, for example, and they found that the trees will actually synchronize their rates of photosynthesis.
What does that mean?
So they're all kind of like coordinating how much food they're producing, and they're sharing resources in a way that allows all of them to be equally successful.
So even if one tree is in a better spot than another one.
Right, exactly. Even if one tree has more sunlight or better soil, they're still sharing resources to make sure everyone's doing okay.
That's incredible. So it's like this whole community effort to thrive.
Yeah, and it actually makes the forest as a whole more productive.
Really?
Yeah, because they're optimizing the use of water and nutrients.
Wow.
So when foresters come in and try to thin out the forest to reduce competition, they're actually often doing more harm than good.
Interesting. So it's like they're disrupting the natural balance?
Exactly. They're disrupting this delicate balance that's evolved over centuries.
And Wohlleben actually did a really interesting experiment.
He did, yeah.
Where he illustrated this really effectively.
Yeah.
Do you remember that one?
Yeah, the girdling experiment.
The girdling, yeah.
Where he removed a strip of bark all the way around the trunk of a tree.
Right.
Which normally would kill the tree.
Right, because it cuts off the flow of nutrients.
Exactly. It cuts off the flow of sugars from the leaves to the roots. But what he found was that some of these trees actually survived.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because their neighbors were pumping nutrients and sugars to them through the root system.
Wow.
And they were able to keep those trees alive.
So it's like a life support system.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like the forest is literally taking care of its own.
That's incredible. And it really highlights how connected they all are.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about communication.
Yeah.
We've talked about this social behavior.
Yeah.
But trees also have to contend with threats.
Right. Yeah. All sorts of threats.
Like insects and animals and diseases.
Yeah.
So how do they defend themselves?
Well, one of the first things that Wohlleben observed was that trees actually register pain.
Really?
Yeah. So when an insect starts nibbling on a leaf, the tree sends out electrical signals from the site of the injury.
Interesting.
It's not as fast as our nervous system,
Okay.
but it does trigger the production of defensive compounds that can make the leaves taste bad or even be toxic to the insect.
So they're not just sitting there passively.
No, they're definitely fighting back.
And they can even tailor their defenses based on the specific threat, right?
Exactly. So we talked about how they can recognize the saliva of specific insects and release pheromones to attract the predators of those insects. It's a very targeted defense strategy.
That's amazing. So it's like they have this whole arsenal of weapons at their disposal.
We do, yeah.
To protect themselves.
And they can even, produce toxins in their leaves and bark to deter herbivores.
It's like what kinds of toxins?
So oaks produce tannins, which are really bitter and can be toxic to insects. Willows produce salicylic acid, which is a precursor to aspirin.
Oh, wow. So it's like they're making their own medicine.
Yeah, exactly. It's really incredible.
So they're not just passively sitting there. They're actively defending themselves. So let's talk about reproduction, because that's another area where trees have some really interesting strategies.
They do, yeah.
So how do they make sure their offspring have the best chance of survival?
Well, one of the things they do is try to spread their seeds as far and wide as possible. So some trees, like poplars and willows, they have these really light, feathery seeds that can be carried by the wind for miles.
Right.
Other trees, like oaks and beeches, they have heavier seeds that are dispersed by animals, like squirrels and jays, who bury them and then sometimes forget where they buried them.
Right, right.
And then those seeds have a chance to germinate.
So it's like they're using the animals to do their planting for them.
Yeah, exactly. It's a pretty clever strategy.
And they also have ways to avoid inbreeding, right?
Do, yeah.
Because that can be a problem for any species.
Mm-hmm.
So how do they make sure they're not just constantly breeding with their close relatives?
So some species, like willows, for example,
Okay.
have separate male and female trees.
Okay.
So they can only reproduce with another tree of the opposite sex,
Right.
and that prevents self-fertilization.
Okay.
And even in species where the male and female flowers are on the same tree,
Mm-hmm.
they often have different flowering times.
Oh, wow.
So the male flowers might bloom first,
Okay.
and then the female flowers will bloom later,
Right.
and that reduces the chances of self-pollination.
So it's like they've got this whole system in place to maximize genetic diversity.
Exactly, yeah. They've evolved these really clever strategies to make sure that their offspring are as healthy and diverse as possible.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Let's talk about growth and aging, because trees live for a very long time.
They do, yeah.
Some of them live for hundreds or even thousands of years.
Yeah.
So what can we learn about their life cycle from looking at their growth patterns?
Well, one of the things that surprised Wohlleben was how old some seemingly young trees can be.
Okay.
So he talks about finding beech saplings
Hmm.
that were only a few inches thick,
Okay.
but when he counted the nodes on the twigs,
Which are those little bumps, right?
yeah, those little bumps where the buds form each year,
Mm-hmm.
he realized that these trees were actually decades old.
Wow, so they were growing very slowly.
Very slowly, yeah, especially in the first few years of their lives.
Why is that?
Well, they're often competing for sunlight in the understory.
Right.
So they might only grow a few inches a year
Okay.
until they can get tall enough to reach the canopy.
And they face other challenges as well,
They
right?
do, yeah.
Like competition from other plants, and damage from animals.
Yeah, so climbing plants like honeysuckle can actually strangle young trees.
Really?
Yeah, they wrap around the trunk,
Oh.
and they can eventually cut off the flow of nutrients.
Oh, wow.
And animals, like deer, can also damage young trees by rubbing their antlers on them or eating the bark.
So it's a tough world out there for a young tree.
It is, yeah. It's a real struggle to survive.
And what about the bark?
The bark.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just a uniform covering, is it?
No, it's actually quite complex.
Okay.
It changes as the tree ages.
Okay.
So young trees tend to have smooth bark, and then as they get older,
Yeah.
they develop wrinkles and cracks.
And that's different for different species, right?
It is, yeah. So some species, like beeches and silver firs,
Okay.
they maintain smooth bark for a long time.
Okay.
But other species, like pines and oaks, they develop thicker, more fissured bark earlier in life.
And those wrinkles can actually tell us something about the tree's history, can't they?
They can, yeah. So in beeches, for example, moss tends to grow in the wrinkles of the bark. Okay.
And the higher up the trunk the moss grows,
Yeah.
the older the tree is likely to be.
Wow, so it's like a little timeline.
Yeah, kind of like a little timeline etched into the bark.
That's fascinating.
Even sunlight exposure can affect the bark texture.
Really?
Yeah, so the side of the tree that gets more sun will often have rougher bark
Okay.
than the side that's in the shade.
Interesting. So it's like the bark is a record of the tree's life.
Exactly, it's like a living history book.
So this brings up an interesting question.
Okay.
What exactly defines a tree?
That's a good question.
Like, what about a stump that's
Yeah.
being kept alive by its neighbors?
Yeah.
Or new growth that sprouts from an old stump?
Yeah.
Is that still a tree?
It's a tricky one.
Yeah.
Wohlleben argues that the root system is really the most important part of the tree.
Okay.
Because the root system is what connects the tree to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
It's what absorbs water and nutrients. And it's what stores the tree's memories and experiences. Memories and experiences.
Yeah, I mean, not memories in the way that we think of them,
Right.
but more like a record of the tree's growth and development.
Okay.
So even if the trunk of a tree dies, the root system can still be alive.
Okay.
And it can send up new shoots.
So in a way, the tree can live on.
Exactly, yeah, it can regenerate itself.
That's pretty amazing. And there's actually a really good example of this in Sweden, right?
There is, yeah. They found a spruce tree that's over 9,550 years old.
9,550 years old.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
It's amazing, isn't it? And the individual shoots of the tree, they're only a few hundred years old.
Okay.
But the root system has been alive for all that time.
Wow.
So it's really the root system that's the ancient part of the tree.
So it's like this ancient being that keeps regenerating itself.
Exactly. Yeah, it's incredible.
Okay, let's talk about the soil.
Okay.
Because that's another really important part of the forest ecosystem.
It is, yeah. It's the foundation of everything.
So what's going on beneath the surface?
So the soil is teeming with life.
Okay.
There are billions of bacteria, fungi,
Yeah.
tiny insects, and other creatures all living in the soil.
Wow, it's like a whole universe down there.
It really is, yeah. And all of these organisms are interacting with each other and with the trees.
So how do they benefit the trees?
Well, fungi, for example,
Okay.
they play a really important role in breaking down organic matter
Okay.
and releasing nutrients that the trees can then absorb.
So they're kind of like the recyclers of the forest.
Yeah, exactly. They're breaking down dead leaves and wood and turning them into nutrients that the trees can use.
So it's a really important cycle.
It is, yeah. And without these soil organisms, the forest wouldn't be able to thrive.
So it's really a partnership between the trees and the soil.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a symbiotic relationship.
And Wohlleben mentions these weevils.
He does.
That are indicators of old forests.
Yeah.
So what's the story with those?
So there are certain species of weevil that live on the forest floor, and they move very slowly.
Okay.
Like they only travel about 30 feet a year.
Wow, that is slow.
Yeah. So if you find these weevils in a forest, it's a good indication that the forest has been undisturbed for a long time.
Why is that?
Because if the forest had been cleared at some point, the weevils wouldn't have been able to recolonize it.
Because they're so slow.
Yeah, they're just too slow.
So it's like they're little markers of the forest's history.
Exactly, yeah.
That's amazing. So we've talked about the soil. Let's go back to the fungi for a second.
Okay.
Because we touched on them earlier.
Yeah.
But I want to delve a little deeper into this partnership between trees and mycorrhizal fungi.
So the mycorrhizal fungi, they form these symbiotic relationships with the tree roots.
Okay.
And they basically extend the reach of the roots.
Okay.
Allowing the trees to access water and nutrients that they wouldn't be able to reach on their own.
So they're like little extensions of the root system.
Yeah, exactly. And in return, the trees provide the fungi with sugars that they produce through photosynthesis.
So it's a win-win situation.
Yeah, for the most part.
Okay.
But the fungi can be pretty demanding.
Really?
Yeah, they can take up to a third of the tree's total food production.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, so it's a pretty costly relationship for the tree.
But it's clearly worth it.
It must be, yeah, because otherwise the trees wouldn't do it.
Right.
And what's really interesting is that the fungi can actually manipulate the growth of the root tips.
What do you mean?
So they can release chemicals that cause the root tips to branch and grow in a certain direction.
So they're actually directing the growth of the roots.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's like they're little architects of the root system.
That's wild. So we've talked about the beneficial relationships, but trees also have to deal with pests, right?
Right. Yeah, they're constantly under attack.
So how do they cope with that?
Well, they have a variety of defenses. Okay.
Like we talked about before, they can produce toxins.
Yeah.
They can release pheromones to attract predators.
Right.
But they're also in a constant arms race with the pests.
What do you mean?
So as the trees evolve new defenses, the pests evolve ways to overcome those defenses.
Okay.
It's like a constant back and forth.
So it's like an evolutionary battle.
Exactly, yeah.
So give me an example of that.
So, for example, bark beetles.
Okay.
They can be a real problem for trees.
Okay.
And they have evolved ways to overcome the tree's defenses.
How do they do that?
Well, some bark beetles, they carry fungi with them.
Okay.
And these fungi can actually neutralize the tree's chemical defenses.
Oh, wow.
So the bark beetles can then bore into the tree and lay their eggs.
And that could be really damaging to the tree, right?
It can be, yeah. It can weaken the tree
Right.
and make it more susceptible to other pests and diseases.
And what about larger herbivores?
Yeah.
Like deer?
So deer can also be a problem for trees.
Okay. Especially in areas where their populations are high.
Okay.
Because they can eat a lot of young trees.
Right.
And they can also damage mature trees by stripping the bark.
So it's like they're impacting the forest at multiple levels.
Exactly.
So it's not just the little insects.
Yeah.
It's the big animals as well. And trees also provide homes for a lot of creatures, right?
They do, yeah.
Like birds and bats and squirrels. So what kinds of homes do they offer?
So woodpeckers, for example, they create cavities in trees.
Right.
And then those cavities can be used by other birds.
Okay.
Bats, squirrels, all sorts of animals.
And those cavities can be really important for those animals, right?
They can, yeah, they provide shelter from the elements.
Right.
And they can also be used for nesting and raising young.
So it's like the trees are providing this whole ecosystem of housing.
Exactly. Yeah, they're creating habitat for all sorts of creatures.
So we've talked about all these interactions between trees and other organisms.
Yeah.
But trees also interact with the broader environment, right?
You do, yeah.
Like the wind and the water and the climate. So let's talk about some of those interactions.
Okay.
So how do trees deal with wind?
Well, one of the things they do is shed their leaves in the fall.
Right.
Which reduces their surface area and makes them less vulnerable to wind damage.
That makes sense.
And they also have flexible trunks and branches that allow them to bend and sway in the wind instead of breaking.
So they're going with the flow, so to speak.
Exactly, yeah. They're adapting to the forces of nature.
And in intact forests, the trees actually support each other, right?
They do, yeah, because they're so close together.
Yeah.
The wind can't get as much force behind it,
right.
so it's less likely to knock them over.
So they're stronger together.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about water?
Water.
Yeah, I mean, how do trees get water all the way up to their leaves?
So that's a question that's fascinated scientists for centuries. And we still don't fully understand all the mechanisms involved.
Okay.
But we know that it involves a combination of capillary action transpiration, which is the evaporation of water from the leaves, and osmosis, which is the movement of water across a membrane.
So it's this complex interplay of forces.
Yeah, it's really amazing how it all works together.
And there's even some evidence that trees might be making sounds.
Yeah, some researchers have detected faint noises in tree trunks that might be related to water stress.
What kinds of noises?
Like clicking and popping sounds.
Really?
Yeah, it's still not entirely clear what these sounds mean.
Okay.
But it's an area of ongoing research.
That's interesting. So there's still a lot we don't know about how trees transport water.
Exactly.
So let's talk about carbon.
Okay.
Because forests play a really important role in the global carbon cycle.
They do, yeah.
So how do they do that?
So trees absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and they use that carbon to build their trunks and branches and leaves.
Okay.
So they're essentially storing carbon in their bodies.
So they're like carbon sinks.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's really important for mitigating climate change, right?
It is, yeah, because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas.
Right.
And when there's too much of it in the atmosphere, it traps heat and causes the planet to warm.
So by absorbing carbon dioxide, forests are helping to slow down climate change.
Exactly, yeah. They're really important for keeping our planet healthy.
And older trees are actually better at storing carbon, right?
They are, yeah.
So it's important to protect those old-growth forests.
Absolutely, yeah. They're incredibly valuable.
And forests can heavily influence their local climate as well, can't they?
They can, yeah. So deciduous forests, they create a more humid and temperate environment than open areas or coniferous forests.
How do they do that?
Well, the canopy of leaves, it shades the ground, which keeps it cooler. And the leaves also release water vapor into the air, which increases the humidity.
So it's like they're creating